Hello, and welcome to this talk on pacifist approaches to Thucydides in the interwar years. This topic may strike my audience as strange, initially at least. After all, the overwhelming focus of Thucydides' work is on war. In the first line of the history, he declares that he has taken as his subject the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, which lasted from 431 to 404 BC. This war, he explains, engulfed the entire Greek world and drew in many barbarians as well. The savagery of its violence and the amount of men and materials it consumed, he continues, was unparalleled in previous history. Thucydides calls the war the greatest kinesis, or commotion, to have ever afflicted mankind. It is no surprise to find, therefore, that the majority of the narrative of his history focuses on the causes of that war, the strategies employed by the various Greek states, and the battles, skirmishes, military disasters, and massacres that characterize the conflict. That said, for the past 400 years or so, scholars, translators, and political commentators have looked to Thucydides to understand not only how to fight wars, but also how to avoid them. A prominent tradition has emerged since the writings of Thomas Hobbes that has imagined if only one could understand the true import of Thucydides' view of the world and human nature, then it might be possible to avoid the kind of war that engulfed the Greek world. Hobbes imagines that Thucydides taught his readers the dangers of tumultuous government at home, lest it might lead to expansion abroad. The idea that Thucydides educates us about war so that we may live in peace has continued right up to the present day. A famous recent exponent is Graham Allison, whose notion of the Thucydides trap. This is the idea taken from Thucydides' assertion that the fear the rise of Athens instilled in Sparta was the truest cause of the Peloponnesian War. Allison posits that this is a mechanism that has been at work throughout modern history, leading to no less than 11 major conflicts. It is a lesson that Allison wishes contemporary America to heed, lest she herself find herself in a war with China. Such readings are hardly pacifist, despite their ostensible pursuit of peace. They do not avoid war because it is morally or ethically wrong, but because the author, Hobbes or Allison, feels it is the worst outcome for his particular state. In what follows, I wish to discuss two genuinely pacifist readings of Thucydides, by the British scholar T.R. Glover and the Canadian Charles Cochrane. Their readings of the text identified Thucydides as possessed of a realistic, empirical, even scientific view of politics that accurately described the 5th century world and Europe at the time of the Great War. However, both writers, deeply influenced by their Christian views, thought that Thucydides' genius is extended only so far as to identify the political problem, that is to say, the causes of war and the destruction that it inflicts upon civil society. Unlike Allison and Hobbes, these two scholars did not imagine that Thucydides offered a moral, ethical, or political answers to the problem of war, nor did he offer any solutions to the problem of how man can ensure peace. I will start with Glover, who, when the Great War broke out, was a fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, and the university's Latin orator. Glover was known among scholars primarily for his work on Latin poetry and literature. Among the general public, he was most famous for his work as a lay Baptist preacher, who travelled around the country giving sermons to packed-out congregations, and was famously a traditionalist in matters of hymnals. The outbreak of the Great War troubled Glover's beliefs. He was convinced that Imperial Germany had to be stopped, but he could not let go of his Christian desire for conscientious objection and pacifism. These seemingly incompatible beliefs led him to start work on a book of Greek history during the war. Named from Pericles to Philip, the book described from the perspective of key witnesses the decline of Greece, from the glories of the 5th century to a loss of liberty under the Macedonians, King Philip and King Alexander in the second half of the 4th century. The book was first published in 1917, at the height of the war, and enjoyed enough success to be reprinted numerous times. The chapters focus not only on events, but the way Herodotus, Demosthenes, and other writers presented this decline of Greece and reflected upon it in real time. Thucydides occupies a key position in the book, because it is with his description of the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War that, Glover believed, the process of decline had truly begun. The problem Thucydides poses in Glover's reading can be phrased like this. Athens had defeated the Persians and begun a cultural miracle, epitomised by the flowering of drama, architecture, philosophy, and the arts in the middle of the 5th century. At the same time, however, Athens was a harsh imperial mistress to her subject empire in the Aegean. This means that she failed to take on a position of responsible leadership in the Greek world. This lack of leadership by Athens or indeed any other state led directly to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Almost certainly, I think, in penning this potted history, Glover was thinking here of Britain's place in the world as a maritime Victorian empire at the apogee of our power and our cultural influence, who had similarly failed to stop the outbreak of a great war among her near neighbours. Thucydides is a difficult thinker for Glover to pin down. He nowhere condemns the Athenian Empire, as one might expect. Ostensibly, he describes the war in a cold and detached, one might even say realist way, that at first sight betrays no emotion or ethical concern for the events as they unfold. However, Glover could not bring himself to think so ill of so great a mind. Instead, Glover demonstrates that through gut-wrenching depictions of the casualties of war, particularly how vulnerable they are to the whims of larger powers and indeed chance, Thucydides was, in fact, a man of great feeling who described not only the causes and course of the war, but also its pitiable nature in vivid prose. Thucydides' literary artistry and historiographical project was presented by Glover as something that was immediately identifiable and understandable to British readers who had lived through the terrible effects of the 1914 to 1918 conflict. The barbarism of Mykolassos, the cold-hearted brutality of Milos seemed so much more immediate to those who had seen the trenches for themselves or may have sent off family members. This, Glover believed, was truly relevant and truly powerful for British readers. But Thucydides, in his view, described only what happened. He offered no answers to how humans might escape this tragic pattern of history, how they might avoid war, how they might even make war unthinkable. Glover was under no illusion that Thucydides' depiction of war, as he claimed, would recur again and again throughout history. But what Glover really wanted to know from Thucydides was how one might break the cycle. This aspect to Glover's work was identified by one of his Baptist acquaintances, an otherwise unknown individual from Birmingham named Maynard. In a letter to Glover, written soon after the book was published, Maynard described how he is now reading Glover and Thucydides in preference to the newspapers. What else, he argues, does he need to know about war other than what is contained in these pages of ancient history? However, Maynard's key point is that these books are only relevant during the war. He can only read them for news while Britain, France, and Germany are tearing themselves apart in the trenches. Once peace is concluded, then new texts and new modes of thinking will need to be discovered to create a new moral and political system that won't just avoid war, but consign it to the dustbin of history. Maynard is under illusions that Thucydides offers no such answers. He posits that man must turn instead to the Bible. Glover himself, in his book, similarly offered no answers. Thucydides describes the world as it is, and that world is terrible. One must look elsewhere if one wants to reconstitute the political order. Similar notions of the limits of Thucydides' thoughts are found in the work of Charles Cochrane. Cochrane was a Canadian academic based at the University of Toronto. He spent some time in the early 1920s in Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, but the rest of his career was firmly spent within Canada. At this stage, he was still a young scholar. Cochrane would go on to become a famous public intellectual over there, who would make it his life's work to explore the tensions and synergies between classical and Christian thought. His main contribution to Thucydidean scholarship came in 1929, when he published a book, Thucydides and the Science of History. This is a book that has been panned widely by Thucydidean scholars since its release. It has become the exemplum of the discredited view that Thucydides was in some sense a historical scientist who saw the world in a rigidly empirical way. From its publication, it has received negative views. Then Enoch Powell, for example, called it the very worst book ever written on Thucydides. And today it is still cited by scholars such as Josh Ober as the epitome of this Thucydides and the Science of History view, and it is summarily dismissed as such. In what follows, I do not wish to defend Cochrane's scientific interpretation, but rather to place it in some kind of context, to link it to his overall moral, ethical, and political interpretation of Thucydides and the causes of war. To do this, I must briefly, to start with, consider Cochrane's scientific view of Thucydides. Cochrane imagined that Thucydides was profoundly influenced by Ionian philosophy via the Hippocratic medical writers. They had been fascinated by the notion of prophasis, the idea that things could be reduced to an identifiable cause. Where the Ionians had looked to understand the causes of natural events, the Hippocratics had turned to the causes of disease. Thucydides thought that he might look to the causes of human events, human political orders, and human situations. Particularly, Thucydides, of course, was interested in the causes of war. This endeavour led Thucydides to adopt what Cochrane terms a scientific mindset. To truly understand the causes of the war, he had to categorise and understand the various ways that men organised themselves into political communities. He also had to organise and understand the different ways in which men thought and acted, and the ways that these conflicted. In other words, Thucydides' vision of historical science was allied to an empirical methodology of observation. In a chapter on international relations in Thucydides, Cochrane explains that the Athenian historian's historical science had led him to realise that the humanism, that is to say the focus of man as the measure of all things in Greek thought, had not been enough to stop the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Greek international law, in the form of the Peace of Callias, signed in the middle of the 5th century, which had kept an ostensible peace between Athens and Sparta, was incapable of reining in the political passions. Thucydides was a brilliant writer, and one might even say a genius, because he could identify and characterise the units into which men organised themselves. He could describe how they formed and grew, how they came to fight each other, how they evolved over time, how they gained power, how they gained economic wealth. Moreover, Thucydides understood the changing role of power and relationships in international relations. He was, in sum, a truly great scientific historian. One might even go so far as to say the first political scientist. For Cochrane, however, what he could not do was offer any answers to how the Greeks, or indeed the moderns, might avoid the recourse to brute force that led ultimately to this war and its destruction. In other words, the focus on man as he really is, the focus on science and gathering empirical facts is important. It demonstrates to you the world as it really is. But it leaves a space. It leaves a space for philosophy and morality that Thucydides, in Cochrane's view, had not filled, and therefore only went so far in man's quest to understand the outbreak of war and the nature of political society. Cochrane doesn't say so explicitly in his book, but one of the motivations for making this critique of the limits of the Thucydidean project was to demonstrate to his readers the similar limits of scientific history and political science today. Instead, Cochrane imagined that statesmen and scholars needed to allow room for faith in their discussion of politics, as we can see in this quotation from a letter to a similar Canadian scholar named Louis Beer. Thucydides, for Cochrane, became emblematic of a certain scientific mindset, that remains crucially important in diagnosing the ills of political society, in educating future statesmen and historians, but who needs to be augmented by a concern in morality, ethics, philosophy, and religion. Thucydides, as with Glover, identifies a problem, but he cannot offer any solutions. It is this analysis of the limits of Thucydides' political thought, on the limits of Thucydides' applicability to the modern day, and in differing ways, of course, that I think make Glover and Cochrane's readings so interesting and, dare I say, so important. Many contemporary scholars, particularly in political science and international relations, like Allison, and many historical scholars, like Hobbes, have imagined that if an intelligent reader comes to Thucydides, just as Thucydides hoped might happen, then there are very definite lessons that can be learnt from the text, lessons that can be applied to the modern world to make it a better place. Glover and Allison, Glover and Cochrane, I think, are much, much more circumspect. In a world torn apart by the trauma of the Great War, in a world in which the old certainties have died, they turn not to Thucydides for answers, but for a depiction of the contemporary world, for a brutal and empirical and knowledgeable depiction of the contemporary world, and a depiction of the world that has value, not in the pursuit of some kind of simplistic answers, but in this way that Thucydides offers a provocation. Thucydides seems to say, here is the world and it is disgusting. Can we do any better? Is there anything else we can do? As Glover says, the world is thus, Thucydides, fecit.